Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 2023 Northwest Pinball and Arcade Show. It is now 2 o'clock, and we have a very special treat in store for you. If you played many games, arcade machines of the 80s, you've probably played this machine. You've probably played Q Bert, and we got the person, the expert to talk about it. How about the creator of Q Bert? Please give it up for Warren Davis.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm very, that is a picture of my waist. As opposed, can I get my my screen up? I actually, it is a visual presentation. There, that's more like it. That's what I like to see. As he said, my name is Warren Davis. I was the designer and a programmer of the original Q Bert. I was 1/3 of a team, as you will learn shortly, of people who made the game. I call us the Q Bert Triumvirate. And I'm very excited to be here up in the Pacific Northwest. It's not a place I get to go to very often, and especially this area. For those of you who are not sitting here, I'm looking at this gorgeous view of Mount Rainier just right out the window. It's astonishing. Anyway, I'm here to talk about the making of Q Bert. Most of you will know me as the Q Bert guy. I am frequently known as the Q Bert guy. I actually had a much longer career in the arcade industry, in the games industry, and the arcade industry. I am so sorry, but I'm going to be referring to my slides like all the time. Thank you. I don't want to look back and see me. That's the last thing I want to see. Anyway, I did work after Q Bert was actually my first game in the industry for Gottlieb, and after that, I still was working for Gottlieb. I made a game called Us versus Them, which was a Laserdisc game. I moved to Williams a couple of years later, where I worked on Joust 2, a redemption game called Lotto Fun, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, and Revolution X featuring Aerosmith. That was pretty much my the actual games I worked on, but my other contribution to the industry is I created a system for digitizing live actors and putting their images into games, and that ended up being used at Williams for games like Narc, High Impact Football, Mortal Kombat, NBA Jam, pretty much every game that Williams did that had digitized images used my system. But we are not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Q Bert. So usually I go through a little recap of Q Bert through the ages, because people have been introduced to Q Bert through different points in history. And the original Q Bert, of course, the arcade game Q Bert, came out it was actually developed in 1982, came out very late in the year. Most people think of it as 1983 because that's when it sort of filtered out into the country, but there was an arcade sequel that I had absolutely nothing to do with called Q Bert's Cubes. I will talk about that more a little bit later. There was and then of course the ports. It was ported to so many systems, all of the systems that were available at the time. And then there was a pinball game called Q Bert's Quest that is fairly rare. I've seen it at a few shows, but it's not too popular. And then there's this that you may know about. This is the Q Bert cartoon show. Actually, can you bump the volume up? I can't hear it at all. Yeah. So, I don't know if anybody remembers this or if anybody ever saw it, but Q Bert was so popular in 1983 that they created a Q Bert Saturday morning cartoon show. It was in rotation with a few other video game things. It was like Frogger and Donkey Kong and maybe one other. And it's interesting because people usually say to me and the rest of the team, what were you guys smoking back then when you came up with Q Bert? Well, we were saying to ourselves, what were these guys smoking when they came up with this cartoon? Because, Q Bert got arms, he speaks English, he's wearing a Letterman jacket, like, what? Yeah. Anyway, moving on, 1992, the character was pretty dormant for many years as we all moved on with our lives. And then 1992, there was a bit of a resurgence. Q Bert 3 for the Super Nintendo, which was actually featured artwork by Jeff Lee, the artist who created all the art for the original. Q Bert for the Game Boy, 1992 as well. A few years later, Hasbro Interactive came out with a PC version. It was 1999. A little interesting side story. There's a thing called the Game Developers Conference that happens in the, I guess it happens in the spring, and it's usually in the San Francisco area. Back in the 90s, it was in San Jose. And I went to it, and I got wind about this resurgence of Q Bert. And just generally, there was a sort of a retro gaming resurgence in the 90s. People were remembering fondly the games of their childhood. So I knew that Sony owned the rights to Q Bert, and that's a long story, but Gottlieb, who I worked for, they were owned by Columbia Pictures. Columbia Pictures got bought by Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola shut Gottlieb down. We'll get to that later, but Coca-Cola sold Columbia to Sony. So the rights to Q Bert, which were owned by Columbia, went to Sony. So I went to Sony at this Game Developers Conference, and I said, you know, with all the resurgence of retro gaming now, why aren't you guys doing anything with Q Bert? And they said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, you own the rights to Q Bert. And they were like, what? We own the rights to Q Bert? And they're calling people and writing things down. And then a year later, this game came out. So I believe I am the person who credited Sony with knowing that they owned the rights to Q Bert. And of course, more recent years, actually it's not that recent anymore, but Wreck-It Ralph, it's hard to believe. I think Wreck-It Ralph is like over 10 years old now. That's up in the top corner. Down here on the bottom is Pixels, a movie that some people liked and some people thought was terrible. But regardless, it brought Q Bert back into the zeitgeist. I do have to say, as much as I love seeing the character back in the limelight, it's a little disappointing to see what they've done to his nose. You know, the little guy used to have a nice, firm nose. It was always pointing up. And now it's like, now I know he's getting older, but still, that's very disappointing. And then, of course, here in 2018, there was another PC version called Q Bert Rebooted, again with the nose. God, what are people thinking? Anyway. Oh, and then the most recent thing, we actually have a live version of it right here. But New Wave Toys, a company that's based not too far from where I live right now in Los Angeles, came out with these Replicades. They're amazing. They're amazingly engineered. I think they're sold out. I mean, they made a limited number. One of them is the production version. The other one is actually called the Warren Davis edition because it is a perfect duplicate of the cabinet I have in my house, the one that's been in my house for the last 40 some odd years. So, but really fantastic machines. And of course, you know, fans and collectors had access in the case if you can't fit an upright arcade cabinet or afford one these days because they're crazy expensive. So anyway, but getting back, let's go back to the history in the beginning. The question that I get asked very often, how did I get my start in the video game industry? And didn't you ask me that very question? How do you get a job making video games? And the answer is I answered an ad in the newspaper. Remember newspapers? They would print things, and they used to have want ads in the back. So I was out of work. I had been an engineer at Bell Laboratories for a couple of years. I was a little bit disillusioned with it, and I quit. I actually quit to study improvisation at Second City, which I enjoyed, but it wasn't really a viable career. And I would look sort of somewhat guiltily in the Sunday paper at the want ads, and one day I found this actual want ad. This is literally the actual ad. December 27, 1981. This company, Gottlieb, was looking for video game programmers. Now, video games were introduced when I was in college, arcade games. And I was a computer engineering major. So I loved the idea of making computer games as a job, but I could not envision how one would get a job like that. And then I saw it in the paper, and I thought, oh my God, I've got to at least attempt to get that job. And so I sent in a resume. I got a response. And this is right around, Christmas and New Year's, right after Christmas and before New Year's. But very early, like first week in January 1982, I'm going to this very building. Now, this is a more modern picture, but it looked exactly like this back in the day, except the blue was a more kind of industrial gray. But other than that, it looked exactly like this. And I went to this building, and as I'm going into the building for my interview, this kind of really large, rotund guy is walking out. And he says to me in a really gruff voice, he goes, "Are you here for the interview?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, watch out for that Waxman guy. He's a real asshole." And I thought, "Oh, okay, thanks for the heads up." Anyway, I went in for my interview. I met with a middle manager there who gave me the tour, and I met the guys working there. I saw the little, where they put it all together. And at the time, there was a whole manufacturing plant that was not being used because they had yet to start producing their first internal game. So there was just a big empty manufacturing plant and some few offices. Wasn't a very big company. And then I had my interview with the vice president of engineering, Ron Waxman. So imagine my surprise when I go to the conference room and I'm waiting for him, and he comes in, and he's the guy who I spoke to outside. Well, I thought, okay. Well, he's still, the same gruff demeanor. He sits with his arms folded, and he was smoking a cigar. I think he always had a cigar in his hand. "Well, what makes you think you can make video games?" "I don't know. I've never tried. I'd like to try." "Do you have a computer at home?" No. This is 1982. Not a lot of people had computers at home. I certainly didn't. I used them at work. Why do I need them at home? Anyway, it went on like that, and just, I thought, okay, I'm not getting this job. But as it turns out, I did. And it just turned out that, I guess that whole thing was just a persona he put on. He was actually a sweet and lovely pussycat of a guy. I have a picture of him here. Yeah, that's him, Ron Waxman. Actually, that's not a photograph. That is a pixelated version of him, and I'll tell you in a minute where that came from. This is my business card, and you'll notice the address, 759 Industrial Drive. That's the building I just showed you. The interesting thing about this is that we were separate from the main pinball plant. That was about 8 miles away in Northlake. And to his credit, Ron and his partner, Howie Rubin, the two of those guys made the Gottlieb video department. They kept us separate by design. They just didn't want the rest of the place sort of interfering, and they wanted a little bit of freedom. And everything that came out of Gottlieb, I credit with those two guys and the department they created. Anyway, the story of the department was they were pretty much the last pinball company to jump on the video game bandwagon, because all the other companies, Williams and Bally, Stern, all based in Chicago, and they all started making video games, and Gottlieb had resisted it, I guess, because the pinball industry took a huge slump in the 70s when video games were invented. Nobody wanted pinball, everybody wanted video. So they had to, roll with the punches, and the pinball industry historically had its ups and downs, which they weathered. But with video games, it was like a new ball game, and they were like, all right. So Gottlieb got into the video game industry late. Their first two games were licensed from Japan, No Man's Land, and New York, New York. Didn't make a big stir, but at least it got them a little familiar. And then they decided to do this internal department, which had been up maybe a year and a half before I was hired. So they also hired somebody who had a track record in the video game industry, a guy named Tim Skelly. And Tim Skelly sort of became the de facto guru for the department because, nobody else had experience making video games, and here's a guy who had a string of hits. Tim Skelly, that's him, who sitting on a row of reactors. So Reactor was the first in-house game made by Gottlieb, designed and programmed by Tim Skelly. And he was like the rock star to us. And he was very generous. It wasn't his job to be our mentor, but he helped us out when he needed to. He showed us some ropes. Speaking of ropes, when I was hired, my first thing was I had to learn the ropes. Never made a video game. Well, at the time, the second game that Gottlieb was working on was a superhero-themed game being programmed by a guy named Tom Malinowski. And it looked a little like this. So it's based on Superman, the second Superman movie with 3 Kryptonian villains, but we couldn't get the rights to Superman, so it's like, you know what? We'll just use a generic superhero. And the thing is, you see the guy in the yellow shirt? I don't know if you can. There was a guy walking there. So there were pedestrians on the floor that you had to save. And I don't know if you saw that, but that was modeled after me. And the guy who made all the graphics, I had an afro back then, and a beard that wasn't white. But the guy that made the graphics was Jeff Lee. He was a fantastically talented artist. And it was amazing. It was just, maybe, 15 pixels high. He could make all these pedestrians that had their own personalities. Their walks all looked different. They all had personalities, and he was a fantastic artist and animator. Anyway, so we had very crude art tools back then. You basically just plopped pixels in a grid. That's the amount of memory we had was ludicrous. Anyway, so the superhero game was put out on test. It did not collect well. And so they didn't know what to do with it. They tried to change things. They thought, well, we'll change a few things, including the name. So the first name was Protector. And they thought, okay, maybe people don't like the name, Protector. So they were, okay, well, we'll call it Video Man. And at one point, they changed the trackball that was controlling it. Well, maybe the problem is the trackball would change it to a joystick. And they tried that, and they called it Guardian this time. And then again, they made some more changes to it, and they put it out again under the name, which I always thought this was the craziest name, Argus. And I just thought it was so silly. They kept changing the name. So I kind of made a joke, and around the office, I called it ProVidGuard Argus. And to this day, I call it ProVidGuard Argus. I mean, the joke really is that, like a year and a half, 2 years ago, Tom Alanowski and Jeff Lee took some old ROMs, and with the help of Doc Mack at the Galloping Ghost in Brookfield, Illinois, they actually released the game Argus. So there are working copies of Argus out now, based on some version of the ROMs. And there was one other version I forgot to mention. Waxman. So this was absolutely true. Jeff created a pixelated version of Ron Waxman, and thought maybe if we make it more comical, that'll fly. It did not work. So anyway, that was the end of that game. It did not get released back then, but I had learned the ropes. I knew how to work the hardware and write the software. So it was like, okay, Warren, make us a game. That was literally what my job was. And I didn't particularly have any game ideas. And I honestly didn't feel like I knew enough. There were certain things I hadn't learned, and I thought I need to teach myself some things. So I was walking in the office one day. We had a big open area. It was more like it wasn't even cubicles. I would call it more like a laboratory. And we just had some tables. We also had these development systems called the blue box. We called them the blue box. It was a massively huge blue box. We only had 3 for the whole place. And we had, we might have had 5 or 6 programmers. So we had to share them. But I was walking around the office one day, and on somebody's monitor, it was Kan Yamamoto. It was a guy who made Mad Planets later on. But this is what I saw. It's basically what is generally called the Escher cube pattern. In reality, this pattern dates back thousands of years. There's like ancient Roman villas where this was tiled in the entryway. It's crazy, but this is a three-dimensional representation of cubes using shaded hexagons, essentially. But when I saw this on the screen, I thought, okay, there's 2 things I wanted to program, learn to program, and one was gravity, like to make something fall with gravity, and the other was randomness. And I hadn't done either of those for Tom's game. So I thought, it's interesting, if a ball were to fall on any single cube, it would have one of 2 ways to bounce. And from row to row to row to row, you just accumulate bits. So in 1 byte of storage, which is 8 bits, I could have 8 random directions, because 0, 1, left, right. I'm a programmer, I dig that stuff. So I thought, okay, what if I carve this into a pyramid? And then suddenly 1 random byte of data gets me the path of a ball from top to bottom. So that was literally all I set out to do. I had Jeff make me an image of a ball, and I just had it bouncing down the pyramid. And I was like, okay, I taught myself randomness and gravity. Fantastic. What next? Well, people from the office, because we all shared this big open space, they would walk around, they'd look at it, and they said, hey, that's pretty cool. You should do something with that. And I thought, okay, I guess I should do something with that. And I thought, well, you could think of this as a play field. And if you put a character on it, he could just hop from cube to cube. And I thought, okay. So I went to Jeff Lee and I said, look, do you have any characters lying around that I could use to throw on the cube? And he was like, on the play field. And he said, yeah. And he put a whole bunch of characters up on the screen that he had created just for his own grins. And I liked the one that was sort of oval with the long nose because he looked kind of pathetic. And I thought, okay, I think I want my character to look pathetic. So I did that, and I got that working. So basically, make a pyramid, program the balls. I succeeded. What am I going to do next? Well, okay, I got that done. I had to get all the angles and stuff, and Jeff made me all the artwork I needed. Everything else sort of came fairly fast. It just seemed very obvious to me. So you want to have the player character collide with the balls. Of course, he's jumping around and the balls are falling. And then I thought, well, he's got to be able to fall off because there's got to be some danger, This was something a lot of people pushed back on. They didn't want Q Bert to be able to jump off the pyramid. And I thought, that's weird. I mean, it's like if you're going to play the game, you should learn how to stay on the playfield, right? So I kind of stuck to my guns about that. It's really funny. Howie Rubin, one of the heads of the department, went to some kind of a trade show in Japan, and he tells this story. He says he left for 2 weeks, and when he came back, the game was just done. He didn't even know it existed, and all of a sudden he came back from this 2-week trip. The reality is not quite that. He's exaggerating. There was still more work to be done. Because it still wasn't a game. I had the character hopping around this playfield, avoiding the balls. That's it. And then, I used to work late. I used to stay at work late. And, the thing is, I progressed this to a certain spot where he's jumping around, the balls are falling, but it wasn't really a game yet. And another thing is that Ron Waxman had this habit of after hours, he would leave his office and come sit in the big open area. And sometimes he'd sit behind you and just watch you work. And that's what he was doing. One night he's sitting behind me and he's smoking the cigar and he's breathing. You can hear him breathing. He sounded like Darth Vader, and I'm just trying to get ideas. I'm just trying to get inspiration. And out of nowhere, I hear his voice and he says, what if the cubes change color when you land on them? And I thought, yeah. So that's when it became a game to me, because now you had a goal. So that was thanks to Ron Waxman. And again, the rest of the stuff sort of came very, very quickly. You want to have an enemy. Jeff came up with I gave Jeff completely free rein to create whatever weird characters he wanted, because to me, there was no story here. It was just about a game. It was just about you trying to accomplish a goal. And so I gave Jeff free rein with the characters. He created this crazy snake that was 2 sprites high instead of 1 sprite. The escape discs, were, again, just an obvious idea. If he's jumping off the pyramid and it's dangerous, give him a lifeline. So you had escape discs, Slick and Sam, who get in the way, thwart everything. The green ball, freezes the screen. Now, Ugg and Wrong Way. Ugg and Wrong Way was Jeff's idea, and I gave him a lot of pushback because, frankly, I did not know how to do it. I didn't know how to implement it. It's tough enough to simulate 3-dimensional movement on a 2-dimensional plane when you have no floating point coprocessor. You have barely enough time to put the sprites on the screen. It's just, the processors were so limited. And I was like, how can I do this? So I just said no to that feature, but it's kind of stuck in my craw because I thought it was such a cool idea. The idea is that they'd be coming up and their plane of gravity would just be a different. Well, I figured out how to do it. At one point, I just had this inspiration. I was like, you know what? I think I can do it. So I did. So that's how we got Ugg and Wrong Way in the game. Now, in the middle of the development of Q Bert, Remember, I showed you my other business card. This one, you'll see the address is different. Management had the bright idea to merge the video department back into the main plant in Northlake. And, I'm sure they had their reasons. The reactor was already out there and other games were in development. And I'm sure that they wanted to bring everybody back. Well, they didn't really do it well. They didn't handle it well. They didn't introduce us to anybody. Now, we were all pinball fans. So we were excited about going back to the pinball plant and meeting the pinball designers. We thought that'd be the coolest thing. Well, we didn't know that the pinball designers had always wanted to work on video. And when Gottlieb started the video department in a location 8 miles away and didn't invite any of the pinball designers to start working on video, they were pissed off. So the first day we show up at the office in Northlake, we go into our new digs, which is this big room with cubicles now. We get our own cubicles. Some people even get offices on the outside. We're getting the stink eye from all these pinball guys that we admire. And we didn't know why. We didn't understand. But eventually it all came out, and we all became friends. But at the beginning, it was very rough going. This is the only picture that I have of myself developing Q Bert. There are a few interesting things to point out here. Let's see. This doesn't really work. But if you look at the monitor, you'll see the pyramid is upside down. And that's because I was working on the cocktail version. In the cocktail game, the screen rotates vertically when players switch. So that's why the pyramid is upside down. Another thing that you might not notice at first glance, if you look under the screen, there is a bucket, a Tupperware bucket, a plastic Tupperware bucket where the joystick is mounted. It's literally mounted to an upside-down Tupperware bucket. You'll also notice that it's rotated into a diamond because it was a 4-way joystick. And, of course, for Q Bert, you don't go up, down, left, and right. You go up to the left, up to the right, down to the left, which to me was absolutely obvious. But when people came over to my cubicle to play the game, because that's what we did. Everybody went to everybody's cubicle and tried out things. They would always rotate and straighten it out. And then, of course, they couldn't play. And they're like, I'm jumping off. And I had to explain to them, well, you got to rotate it. And so many people, listen, to this day, I don't understand it. So many people couldn't wrap their brain around the idea of just a 45-degree rotation, so you're moving in diagonals. But that's, if you look at the game, that's what you need to do. So anyway, I actually have a picture of Jeff Lee. Also not a photograph. But this actually is Jeff Lee, only he is in a poster. He was drawn into the poster and the side art for Us Versus Them. But here's an actual picture. This is an actual photograph taken from a video. Actually, there was one day where I was just shooting video for fun in the office, and I grabbed this as a frame grab. Someday, I will show that video. It's very embarrassing. We are all acting like morons. Okay. Now, why does Q Bert talk the way he does? Well, this is very, this brings us to the third member of our team, the third member of the triumvirate, who just spoke here on this very stage, Dave Thiel. Here's a picture of him taken, I think, in the late 80s after having one too many drinks at a trade show. The way Q Bert uses sound, this is Gottlieb's soundboard. And the chip that is pointed to is called a Votrax chip. The Votrax chip makes human speech. And the way it does is by you stringing together numbers that represent human phonemes. Phonemes are little bits of speech like f, v, duh. These are phonemes. And when you string them together, you get words. But Dave hated this chip because it sounded so terrible and robotic. And he had used it on some pinball games to say things like bonus. But he hated it because it always sounded like bogus. So he literally, he just hated working with his chip. But he had the brilliant idea for Q Bert, wow, what if I just throw random phonemes, random numbers at this chip? And essentially, that's what Q Bert's speech is. It's just random numbers. Now, there's more to it than that, but that's essentially what's happening. He does say a couple of things in English. When you power the game on, he says, hello, I'm turned on. And when you enter your initials into the high score table, after that, he says, bye-bye. So, that's basically the only speech in the entire game. People think they hear things. What he's doing is gibberish. It's literally gibberish. If you hear something, maybe that says something about you. Anyway, so how did Q Bert get his name? This is another question I'm asked a lot, and it's actually an interesting story. I was developing the game. I had no name for the game. This is my first game. I was barely, I didn't even trust that I could finish this game or know what I was doing when it came to making a game. So, I called it the Cubes game. This is just some code. And I know usually this is on a much bigger screen. I'm sorry if you can't see it, but you'll see the name of the game. It's just called Cubes. And the player, it was called Player, P-L-Y-R. I didn't have the name Q Bert didn't exist. None of the characters had their names initially. I think Coily is called Chaser, C-H-S-R, was because he chases the player. But when it came time to put the game out on test, then, we actually had to name it. And Howie Rubin, our VP of Business Development, who is very much of an out-of-the-box thinker, thought, let's call it the Swearing Balloon. And we were all like, what are you talking about? He said, no, that should be the name of the game. And we're like, Howie, how are people going to refer to it? How are people going to talk about it? I mean, are you insane? And he goes, look, if the game's as good as I think it's going to be, people will find a way. And all these years later, I got to think, well, maybe he was right, But, he basically gave in eventually. But he did insist that it gets put out on test. And so, there were test marquees made with this. Q Bert was nowhere to be seen, and it did go out that way just for test, but then he came to his senses. Anyway, the point is, now we still have to name the game. So I think everybody agreed the name of the game should be the name of the title character, the player character. But what was that name going to be? And I went around getting I just did a poll of the people in the office, and I had a huge list of about 30 or 40 names, and they were all terrible. They were all awful. And so we thought, okay, let's have a meeting, because what else are we going to do? So we actually had a meeting, and it was about 10 people, middle managers, Howie, Ron, me, Jeff. Dave Thiel was not there for some reason. I'm not sure why. Rich Tracy, who was the art director of Gottlieb's video department. Dave Birdie, who is our marketing guy. So we had a group of adults. I might have been the youngest person there, but we had a group of supposedly grown men sitting in a room trying to decide what to call this crazy, pathetic-looking character. And it went on for about 2 hours, and we got nowhere. And we're all very discouraged, and we're very tired, and we just want to leave. And in frustration, somebody, and I don't remember who, walked up and wrote on the whiteboard, Hubert. Okay, Hubert. And we all like, what? Why? Why Hubert? And the guys, well, it's a cute name. It's a cute character. Let's just call it Hubert. And we were like, no. But then somebody, and again, I don't remember who it was. Somebody walked up and erased the H and replaced it with a C. Q Bert, because there's cubes in the game, and now everybody's taking notice. We're all sitting up and going, I don't know, that's got something, yeah. And then somebody else went up and they erased the CU and they put a Q dash, and we're thinking like, oh, wait a minute, I think we got something here. And then Jeff Lee, I remember this was Jeff Lee, went up and put the asterisk in, and we were all like, yes, that's it, we've got it. We jumped up, we hugged, we kissed. No, we didn't do that. But we did know. It just literally, it was an amazing moment because everybody suddenly said, that's it. Thank God. Yeah, and we had a name. So that's the story of the name. The Knocker. One of the most unique features, the knocker just went off on this thing. One of the most unique features of the game is it has a pinball knocker in it. A little unusual for a video game. But the idea was, Q Bert jumps off the pyramid to his death. And we had an engineering technician, his name is Rick Ty, and he came up with the idea, and he said, hey, Warren, what if there, he's jumping off the pyramid, what if we put a knocker in the cabinet so it sounds like he's hitting the bottom of the cabinet? And I thought, that's genius. So we put the knocker in, but the knocker sound I didn't like it. It just sounded like a knock. It sounded like somebody's knocking at the door. I was looking for a thud, right? You want the sound of a body hitting the bottom of the cabinet. So we were experimenting with things. We started to put little bits of foam where the knocker hits the wood. And kind of foam, like, I don't know if you remember, but maybe you didn't know. Integrated circuits came in these long tubes, and there was a little piece of foam at the end. And we put that up, and it just deadened the sound just enough. So it was perfect. It was the perfect sound of a body hitting the bottom of the cabinet. We loved that. So we go to management. Hey, we got this great feature. You're going to love this. And they were like, well, yeah, we don't mind the knocker, because I'm sure they had millions of knockers lying around that they had bought they want to get rid of. But the foam was like, but we got to go buy the foam, and then we got to get the labor cost of somebody getting in there and gluing it. So they nixed the foam idea. So, it's a little bittersweet thing for me because, as cool as that feature is, so many people think that feature is amazingly cool, and it is, but I'm just aware of how much cooler it could have been. And if you've never seen one, this is literally what it is. A little tiny thing. There's a piston. You give it a little signal. It shoots the piston out. Anyway, all right, so the game is basically done, and now it's time to test it. Now, this is my first game. I don't know anything about testing or tuning. But, I had to jump in feet first. So there's basically 3 ways that you tune. The first way is in-house testing, and we had done that. So I had a lot of people playing the game while I was making it, which, by the way, they always were like, it's too fast, it's too hard, make it easier. So I was trying to please them. I scaled back. I made it slower. I made it easier. But then we put it out on location testing in arcades. And this was really fascinating because, I'm just there like a fly on the wall watching people play. And sometimes they liked it, sometimes they didn't. I tell this story all the time, but it's true. There was like a young girl came up, put a quarter in the machine, immediately jumped off and died. She just pushed the joystick and died. She got her second life, pushed the joystick, died. Third life, pushed the joystick, died, walked away. And I thought, oh, crap, I'm in trouble. I shouldn't have let him jump off the pyramid. But to her credit, she came back and tried again. She came back later and watched other people who were staying on the pyramid. And it turned out that it tested very well. So thankful, like, whew. But yeah, it's terrifying when you put a game out on test and you just don't know how people are going to react. But we were very lucky. Q Bert was well liked, and then there's another method which is focus groups. Focus groups is when you grab people out of a mall. And you say, would you like to come into this room? We'll pay you $15. You play a video game. We'll give you a pizza, whatever. And I was on the other side of that glass watching. And what I learned is really fascinating. The way people act and what they say, 2 different things. So I would watch people playing a game and being like really into it and be like, and then, the marketing guy would say, well, what do you think of that game? They're like, it's okay. So I learned a lot about that. It's better to judge people by their actions, not their words. Now, if you're technically minded, I do have this one slide that has some technical things. You can forget it or ignore it. But we used an 8088 CPU. It was an Intel chip, the same chip. Well, the 8086 was the 16-bit version that was used in all IBM PCs. The sprites were 16 by 16. Those were in the foreground. The background blocks were 8 by 8 pixels. The screen resolution was 256 by 240, and our total program memory was 64 kilobytes. That's basically what we had to work with. And we can only have up to, I think, 64 foreground sprites on the screen. Yeah, anyway, moving on. So, the game was done, it was tested, it was tuned, it was as good as I thought I could make it, and we had to go public. And here's a picture of a line of Q Berts coming off the production line. This was like an insane moment for me. I mean, still, to this day, something that I created, and they're making it, and it's going out in the world. The interesting thing was, I was still anonymous. Nobody knew or cared who the hell I was, but that was fine with me. It was the game I was concerned about. So the first trade show that Q Bert went to was the AMOA show in 1982. Gottlieb had a booth. They presented it in a big way, and it was really well received by the industry. This is a page from looks like the December 1982 issue of one of the trade magazines. It's either Replay or Playmeter, but I'll zoom in over here. So here's a picture, and this is the reason I have this. It's a lesson in how the press gets a lot of things wrong. So this is a picture. On the very left is Jun Yum, who designed our hardware, the video hardware. Boyd Brown, president of the company. Howie Rubin, vice president of business development, and me on the right, programmer and designer of Q Bert. But it says, Gottlieb's new Q Bert says, designer Jun Yum. They didn't mention he was the hardware designer, so they're implying he's the game designer. Gottlieb president Boyd Brown, they got him right. Notice they got the president of the company right. And programmers Warren Davis and Howie Rubin. So in the wrong order. And so, yeah, there you go. I learned, this is how I learned. My life is all about lessons learned, and this is one of them. Let's see, what's next? Oh, yeah. That's a review. It's a good review. Playmeter put it #1. Playmeter was one of the trade magazines. It was very successful right from the get-go, I have to say. The interesting thing about our industry, and many people don't know this, so Gottlieb was a manufacturer. They built the games. They made their money by selling the games. They don't make their money by the quarters that come in. The people who buy the games, usually distributors, they put those games in arcades, and then they make money from the coins themselves. So, but if it doesn't collect coins, then they don't buy as many. So anyway, but it was a pretty much of a home run. Management was happy. I started getting word that people were playing the game, players were playing the game for a long period of time. Now, it is an arcade game. You put a quarter in, you want to be able to collect money, and if people play for hours on a single quarter, it's usually not a good sign. And I started to get very small reports of this, but still, even to hearing that one, I never envisioned that anybody would get past level 5. I could not get to level 5. So the idea of people getting past level 5 was beyond my imagination. Well, people were getting past level 5, and I started to get worried. And I thought, these were the problems as I saw them. The game was too slow because people in the office kept saying, it's too fast, slow it down, slow it down. And I thought, I made it too slow. It was too easy. I just thought, again, it was my first game. I listened to people in the office, and I made it too easy. And it's not challenging enough because obviously if people are getting past level 5, it's not challenging enough. And I thought, how can I fix these problems? And then it came to me. Make it faster, harder, and more challenging. And so I created faster, harder, more challenging Q Bert, which did not get released. But it's sort of my director's cut, okay? It's the version of Q Bert I like better. It is definitely faster from the get-go. It's definitely harder. The progression of levels is different, and it is more challenging, and I love it. But notice one thing, the copyright. Now, on the original Q Bert, the copyright is Gottlieb, but this is Milestar, and that's because in the middle of the development of Q Bert, and at some point, Coca-Cola owned Columbia, Columbia owned Gottlieb. And I think Coca-Cola was like, oh, we don't want some family name of a obsolete pinball company, so we want to change the name. So presumably they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to some management company to come up with a new name. They had a meeting. They gathered everybody in the company. Boyd Brown, the president, stood in front of a big cardboard thing that was covered with a sheet, proudly announcing that they changed their name to Milestar Electronics. And they showed this beautiful new logo. And I looked at it, and the first thing that I thought, because this is the way my brain works, Does anybody know that's rat slime spelled backwards? Well, I said that out loud, and everybody laughed, except for Boyd Brown. But the fact is, at that point on, we were called Milestar Electronics. The pinball machines still said a Gottlieb pinball, but anyway, Milestar Electronics. So let's see. How are we doing? How am I doing on time? Okay, great. Oh, this is just a little look at faster, harder, more challenging Q Bert. So one of the new things is that Slick or Sam might change the cube to a pattern that Q Bert cannot change. And Q Bert needs to lead either Coily or Q Bertha, who was a new character we added, in order to change it. So that was just one way that it got harder at some point. We also added a bonus round, and I wish I had video of it. I should just grab some video of it. But basically, the bonus round was you couldn't die, and it was just like 1,000,000 Slicks and Sams would drop, and you got points for as many as you can capture. And that would, I think, between levels, there was a bonus round. Now, the thing is, even though this wasn't released back in the day, they put it on test, but it was so close to the original Q Bert, people were still mastering Q Bert. My thought was, well, hold on to it for a year and then release it in a year. But they did not do that. And so it never got released. And then Gottlieb was closed down. So I was working for Disney in 1997 or so. And a colleague of mine, knew the people who created MAME. And once I found out about MAME, because faster, harder, more challenging Q Bert is literally just a ROM swap, no hardware changes. And I said, well, what, you've got Q Bert, I'll give you the ROMs, because basically I had faster, harder, more challenging Q Bert in my cabinet at home, ever since I made it. That was my Q Bert of choice. So I gave them the ROMs, and so ever since 1997, you can play faster, harder, more challenging Q Bert, thanks to MAME. And a lot of people have sort of turned their Q Berts into multi-Q Berts. They do Q Bert, faster, harder, more challenging Q Bert, and Q Bert's cubes. So I'll get to Q Bert's cubes in a second. But right now, the aftermath. Let's talk about the aftermath. Again, nothing you probably don't know. Q Bert was very popular, not only in video game circles, but also mainstream. This is USA Today talking about Q Bert from April 1983. Of course, it was on all the video game magazine covers. I think there's a John Cougar Mellencamp, as he was known then. No, he was still John Cougar. But now he's John Cougar Mellencamp. Vidiot of the month, sitting on a Q Bert. Robin Williams, the Robin Williams movie, Moscow on the Hudson, that featured a nice close-up of Q Bert. So yeah, it was a huge success. This magazine, Video Games Magazine, did a huge feature on the game, and we were interviewed. And the thing is, Gottlieb would not let them use our names in the article, because I guess they wanted to protect us from being hired away. So I was called D-Ziner. That was my moniker. Jeff was called Artiste. And Dave Thiel was called J-Walkman. And that's the way we referred to it. Now, interestingly, this article was a comparison of Q Bert and Joust. Not necessarily a comparison, but basically the idea that we were American-made games. Like most of the hugely popular games are all Japanese. And here were two huge arcade hits in 1983, Q Bert and Joust, both American-made. Williams had no problem letting everybody's name be printed. John Newcomer, Bill Futzenreuter, Eugene Jarvis, Ken Fidesna, everybody involved, their names were in the article, and then we were these guys. So we kind of pushed back, and that's why Faster, Harder, More Challenging Q Bert actually has a title page. Anyway, let's see. These are not that important. The New Yorker, just again, to show that even the New Yorker talking about Q Bert, a little mind-blowing. Glamour Magazine. This is from Glamour Magazine. I mean, I will say, Q Bert was very popular with women. That was another thing, and partially attributed to its success. It wasn't something conscious. It wasn't something intentional. It's a fairly non-violent game. That part was a bit intentional. I'm not a big fan of like shoot 'em ups, and certainly, even if they're supposed to be fun. Anyway, giveaway. Somebody earned a cabinet. Of course, the licensing was a big deal. There are hundreds of licensed Q Bert products. I used to have a few. I still have the little Q Bert plush toy that was in my son's crib when he was a baby. But, actually, I just found a Q Bert Frisbee up in a box in my attic. Yeah. The Mellow Yellow version, that's another thing people talk to me about. We actually made a special version for Mellow Yellow. So, that bonus screen where Q Bert's nose is going into the big thing there? There was a 7-Eleven version where that was a Slurpee, and then we turned it into a Mellow Yellow can. This is the Consumer Electronics show when all the ports came out. My favorite was always ColecoVision. I wasn't really a fan of most of the other ports. Certainly, and the Atari 2600 was terrible, but I have a lot of sympathy because the Atari 2600 was not designed to make a game like Q Bert. Anyway, let's talk about Q Bert's Cubes for just a second. I was asked to make a sequel after Q Bert because it was hugely popular. I wasn't interested because it was my first game and there were so many other ideas and I wanted to pursue other things. So I said, thank you, no thank you. And then there was a guy who sat in the cubicle next to me named Neil Bernstein, who's sort of a new guy, junior programmer. And he said, I've got a little idea for a Q Bert-like game. I said, go for it. So he made Q Bert's Cubes. And, some people love it. I played it recently, and I thought, it's not as bad as I remembered. I thought it was a little too challenging, too difficult to keep your brain wrapped, but it wasn't that bad. Anyway, yeah, and then, of course, Q Bert's Quest. I went on to do other things, and then Coca-Cola, our parent company, decided to shut the company down in fall of 1984. Now, granted, there was a video game slump in 1983, arcade industry. 1983 got worse in 1984 thanks to laser discs, which is a whole nother story. I just did a talk on this at the Game Developers Conference this year. It's a whole nother story. But yeah, Gottlieb was shut down and they were no more. And that was the end of Gottlieb. Here's a picture of the Q Bert triumvirate. This is the first time the three of us occupied the same space since probably, 1984. This was taken in 2016 at the Pinball Expo. We have since... the thing is, we would see each other in pairs, but the three of us hadn't been together. And but since then, we've been the three of us together at least 2 or 3 times. And it's always great to come back and reminisce and just hang out with these guys. I still love them dearly. We're all amazed at what we did. I can't believe it happened. If you are interested, I have a table out here. I've written a book of my memoirs about my video game days. It covers not just Q Bert. Q Bert's a couple of chapters because I went on to work for Williams. I did all that digitizing, many other games, and it's all in the book if you are interested. And I leave you, and of course, any questions, happy to answer questions if you want to come up to the mic. But I will leave you with this one image which will horrify you and stay in your nightmares. Thank you for coming. So anybody have any questions? Going once, going twice. Thank you very much. If you think of a question later, I'll probably be at that table, and I'll be there a little bit later. I'll be there a little bit tonight. I'll be there tomorrow. So come by and say hi. Thank you.